In Canada, the youth vote is an increasing struggle, with half of all millennials identifying as politically independent. So why are we so disconnected from politics? Are we disengaged? Do we trust politicians? We're going to discuss Gen Y's relationship with politics on this episode of the Gen Y Perspective.
Welcome to the Gen Y Perspective. I'm Ashley Peters, and joining me we have Jake Nothdurft. He boasts an impressive resume, having worked with the CBC, Big Brother Canada, and the Much Music Video Awards. So thanks for joining me for round two of our candid Gen Y discussion.
Thank you very much, Ashley. The pleasure is all mine.
And we also have our Commonwealth companions from Brisbane, Australia, joining in on the dialogue. Welcome University of Queensland students Evangeline, Dickson, and Bo Daly.
Hi, thanks for having us.
And just because we're talking here doesn't mean we're tuning you out there. Tweet, Facebook, and Instagram us at #GenYPerspective or go to our website, genyperspective.com, to watch all our videos in their entirety. Millennials have the highest level of political disaffiliation compared to any other generation in the last quarter century. So why are we so apathetic when it comes to civic engagement?
And it's not that we're politically withdrawn, we just have different political leanings than generations before us. In fact, we're known as the most racially diverse age group, with some 43% of millennials being non-white. And because we're so diverse, we also have a mixed bag of politics.
Because of our tech-led politics, Gen Y is forecasted as a group that's on the cusp of starting a social renaissance.
So let's ask the question again. Is Gen Y politically dispassionate?
And we'll forward it to you guys, Evangeline and Bo. My question is, are we disengaged, dispassionate, or just disillusioned?
It's not that we're disengaged, it's that we're disillusioned. I think Generation Y finds it really hard to identify with politics as it is today.
And I think there's an important difference we need to highlight here, because in Canada, we have the option to vote. We have the right to vote, but it's an option for us. Where in Australia, it's called compulsory voting, and you're actually registered and have to vote by law. Can we expand a little more on that, Bo?
Yeah, definitely. So we do have, as you said, compulsory voting. A lot of people at the moment, as a way around that, have chosen not to vote just because they're not really sure who to vote for. They don't really identify with one political party. They're a little bit disengaged or disenfranchised by the leaders. So there is that you do have to vote, but a lot of young millennials are getting around that by actually not voting, because then you avoid a fine. Also, as well, in our Parliament, we do have, because there's a lot of people, not really knowing who to vote for. We have recently seen in Australia that a lot of Gen Y people have ended up doing a swing vote, and at the moment we've ended up with a hung parliament, and there's a lot of minority groups that have been voted because people just don't know, who to vote for. They don't identify with one political party over another.
It's an interesting issue.
Yep. And we want to hear from you. Tweet us, Facebook like us, and Instagram us at #GenYPerspective. To round out our discussion, we have Queensland politics professor, Dr. Dave Eden. Let's hear what he has to say.
How do I think Gen Y affects the political sphere? I think in multiple different ways. On one hand, it creates an industry of political advisors and media types who try to advise people on how to catch the Gen Y vote, which normally never works, and leads to a whole series of ridiculous performances by politicians trying to appear young. But I think there'd be the simple answer, which would say, as soon as Gen Y becomes citizens, they can participate in the political process. But I think more interestingly, not in Australia yet, but around the world, young people have been particularly involved in trying to invent a new politics. Like a minority of young people, but these would be, the people who are involved in Canada in the protests around universities. These would be, peoples in the Arab Spring, in the squares. It's mainly young people who are driving that political reinvention. And that's already changed our language. That's already changed how we think about things, and has raised systemic challenges that people have to talk about. Like, I don't think the G20 would be talking about inequality if the movements hadn't already raised inequality as an issue. And the people who raised that were young people.
So Dr. Dave Eden brought up a really compelling, interesting point. He said that, Gen Y is spearheading new politics. And he cited, with the Arab Spring, the Hong Kong student protests that's actually happening right now, we're kind of mobilizing politically online. And so, a common term that has been thrown at Wires is the pejorative term of slacktivism or clicktivism. Evangeline, what do you think about, our new way of politically protesting online? Is it slacktivism and clicktivism?
I do, to a certain extent. I think it's really easy these days to just, like a certain campaign without really knowing much about it, and that's your contribution in the end, just that like. But just liking something on social media doesn't generate the funding, it doesn't generate social change. So I think social media is a platform for social change, but I don't really think it's Gen Y's political contribution.
Definitely. And let's hear what Dr. Dave Eden has to say about political posturing and why Wires are bored with it.
I think the G20 will probably annoy and distance politics from young people by carrying out the same kind of cynical, shallow performance of politics that I think some young people, maybe most young people, can see through and have no interest in. I think that kind of stage-managed nature of the G20 is the kind of thing that young people will look at and say, this is nonsense. I think the Y20 serves a very good function of giving the G20 a cloak of youth legitimacy. I don't think it's an effective way that young people should pursue attempting to engage with their world. They should be looking at maybe some of the experiences of young people around the world in the new oppositional movements, the movements of the squares, whether they be in the Middle East or Southern Europe or outside Wall Street, and say what worked, what didn't work, what lessons can we pick up. If formal politics appears boring and irrelevant, maybe it is. So perhaps we need to invent a new politics somewhere else.
So an important point that he brought up was this point of new politics. And I think that, in my opinion, social media is this new politics we're talking about, which can open doors and windows into the private lives and personal things that happen to some of our government leaders.
I also think an interesting thing he said was, he was talking about stage management of politics and how it can kind of come off as smarmy and fake and just hot air. So Evangeline, do you think, politicians are sort of inauthentic and come off as just political puppets and they're too stage managed?
I think the fact that Generation Y is so media savvy, it's just so easy to see through it. So that professionalization of politics, that, trying to get hip and down and media savvy, we really do just see straight through it. And ultimately what we want are good policies, genuine policies. We don't just want this veneer of grooviness. We care about politics, we care about the actions, not just what they're posting on Facebook, ultimately.
Yeah. And like birthdays and breakups, G20 summits happen every year. And this year, Australia is the chair of the G20 in Brisbane, Australia.
So the G20 is basically a forum where governments and central bank governors from the world's 20 major economies rally together and they talk international shop.
Yeah, the suited-up politicians began their annual meetings back in 2008 in the wake of the global recession.
And money is always a delicate subject, and the G20 is no exception. Since its inception, intellectuals and anti-globalist protesters and nationalists have knocked G20's policies.
And and Gen Y also has a bone to pick with G20 delegates. For Gen Yers in financial straits, the G20 Leaders Summit couldn't be timelier.
And in fact, Gen Y is the first generation in the modern world to have student debt, poverty, and unemployment. So their discussions on macroeconomics and job creation, as well as strategies on fending off another financial crisis, well, they're very relevant to us.
And luckily for us, our partners at the University of Queensland are in the trenches attending the Global Forum.
And they talked with a few Gen Yers in Toronto to see if they have any vested interest in the G20 or if they even know what it is. Take a look.
What is the G20?
G20? Don't know.
I believe the G20 is a summit that happened
a couple of years ago. It's a group of 20 government heads, and they meet quite often, it sounds like, just talk about international issues, and I know Canada is one of them.
G20 was a riot after a summit that they had, a bunch of world leaders in Toronto.
The G20 is a summit of the 20 most powerful economically most powerful countries in the world.
It's a larger group of nations than the G8 that focuses on forming economic but other forms of stability throughout the world, basically by trying to cooperate together and coordinate activities among nations.
Very, very interesting.
Yeah.
So, I don't know. I thought that Ryerson students, they were trying. How do you feel about that,
I
Ashley?
thought they were a tad aloof. One of the guys mentioned that he thought it was a riot, and he cited the riot that happened at the G20 here back in 2010. Our question to you, Bo, is according to stats, 14% of young adults actually are stumped when they're asked political questions like how Parliament works. Clearly in that video, Ryerson students were a tad absent-minded. If you were to ask your students at Queensland the same question, what is the G20, would they be just as stumped?
I think if you asked them maybe a year ago, they may have been stumped. I think the fact that it's now in Australia has a major impact on the awareness of what it's actually all about, because, for the lead up, we've had a lot of publicity about it, what's on the agenda, and what, they're trying to get out of this. But I think up until about 6 months ago, a lot of people may not be as aware, and I think the media surrounding that's definitely helped to educate them. But I think there's still a lot to do in, educating Gen Yers about politics and the issues that are really important. I think they are aware, but it's just a matter of them being engaged and, seeing what actually does come out of these forums.
And I think it's critically important for Wires to be aware, because one of the main keynote agenda issues is unemployment. And, according to the World Bank, there's 300 million young people unemployed right now, or not working or not studying. So I think it's really germane to us and really relevant. So I think, Wires should keep abreast and, thumb through the newspaper pages and be aware of what's happening.
Or even scroll online, because all the information is there online, on the Twitter feeds, on the Facebook feeds. It's just a matter of us making the effort to look for it.
Exactly. Rolling up our sleeves and doing some reading. All right. And don't forget to tweet us, Facebook us, and Instagram us at #GenYPerspective. You can join the debate and challenge the status quo on Gen Y stereotypes. And also check out our website for related articles and links to this episode's discussion at GenYPerspective.com. We also canvassed and asked our Toronto millennials what the guiding agenda will be for this year's G20. Let's take a listen.
What do you think some of the most important issues will be at this year's G20?
I definitely think with ISIS and ISIL and all of these different groups that are rising up, I think war is going to be a huge thing. And just, I don't want to say fighting back, but trying to deal with the Islamic State.
Part of it is our involvement against ISIS. That's actually been a very large crisis that I've been hearing a lot about. A lot of debate in the House between the Prime Minister wants to get involved, a lot of people say we shouldn't get involved.
We're going to war, which is absurd. I think Canada's image of a peaceful nation, or a nation that helps with the peace process in the world, is diminishing. We've been at war for the past 13 years.
I think one of the overriding themes that we heard from these students is that, they talked about the emergence of the Islamic State and how that might kind of overshadow and eclipse some G20 agenda points of discussion. Evangeline, with the Ebola crisis happening in West Africa, talk about the emergence of the Islamic State, even the most recent Ferguson shooting and race relations in the States. Do you think these issues will be discussed at the G20 meeting?
A few days ago, I had the opportunity to hear the Australian Treasurer, Joe Hockey, speak, and he explicitly said that those agendas would be mentioned. So he specifically referenced Ebola, and he talked about ISIS and climate change. So we just have to wait and see what comes out in the final communique, but he did indicate that they would be specifically addressed.
All right. And, we mentioned before the Y20 is millennials sort of ad hoc committee where it's a bunch of youth, from 60% of the world's population, hand-chosen. And they came together actually in July to draft a communique to bring to the Prime Minister at the tail end of the G20 summit. So what might be on this communique that represents, Gen Y issues that are important to us? I'll hand it off to you, Bo.
I think there's a number of things that they will be recommending. I think firstly the youth unemployment gap is a key focus that they'll be putting forward that needs to be addressed. Another thing that's probably relevant as well to, I say all people, but particularly Gen Y moving forward, and because we are growing into this new global economy where it is equality is really valued. So I think on the agenda is definitely some kind of inclusive growth and ways to actually, bridge the gender gap that is currently, still evident in society.
All right. Now, if you think you're behind in your before 30 bucket list, take a listen to Wyatt Roy. At the unseasoned age of 20 years old, he became the youngest person ever to be elected to an Australian parliament. Here's what he had to say about the G20 and its importance to Wires.
With the G20 here in Brisbane, there's a concern that young Australians, like young voters around the world, are not as engaged in politics as they should be. Wyatt Roy is a federal parliament member representing the Conservative Liberal Party of Australia. He was elected to his seat in Brisbane in 2010 at just 20 years of age.
I am deeply humbled to stand here as a new member of the Australian House of Representatives.
That makes him the youngest person to ever be elected to Australian Parliament. We asked him what Gen Y voters can take away from the G20.
The growth target is important. I was actually talking to the Y20, which is the young leaders for G20, and their focus was on youth unemployment, which is obviously a big issue as people are leaving high school or university or a TAFE level sort of education. They want to be looking for those new jobs, and unless our economy is growing, the global economy is growing, it's going to be very hard to deal with youth unemployment.
For Gen Y voters, Wyatt Roy says his own experience should show how young Australians can be active in politics. He says people should move past perceptions they can't make a difference and actively engage in political discussion.
Of course, I think that the perception that you can't have a direct impact in a major political party or in a major political discussion for a country is just plain wrong. And I would hope to some small measure the fact that I am where I am at the age that I am would show that if you are prepared to have a say, if you're confident enough to convince other people of the merit of your ideas, then you can very quickly make a big difference in society.
Wyatt Roy also spoke about the goals of the G20 and what the forum means for Brisbane and Australia. He says the forum gives local businesses and people in Queensland a chance to showcase their culture to the rest of the world.
I think the G20 is a very exciting opportunity for Brisbane and for Queensland. Obviously, I'm a little bit parochial in that sense, but I think we can showcase what we have here to the world. But I also think that the G20 itself is a very important economic forum for the globe to take action on the important things. And
Sophie Lester reporting from Brisbane for the Global Campus Network.
First of all, what a fantastic story. 20 years old. Ladies, I want to ask you, because it's right in your neighborhood and this gentleman is making an impact right in your home country. At 20 years old, do you think that in his workplace he's going to be taken seriously?
Well, you better hope he's going to be taken seriously. He's been voted into Parliament.
That's right, that's right.
Having said that, it can be a bit of a boys' club, but Wyatt's views and opinions do fit in with his party very well. So I assume they all share the same ideology. So I think he's going to have his voice heard, and obviously he appeals to the Generation Y. So I think they're going to be pushing him to the forefront somewhat to get those younger votes.
And, like you said, he has a young millennial voice. But, by that same token, I feel like females, marginalized, color people are sort of underrepresented in politics. Even when I read in the newspaper this morning, Hillary Clinton, she's in contention for, she's a Secretary of State, but she's in contention to try to become the next president. But people comment about her on her power suits and what she's wearing, rather on her politics. And even, female Canadians, they're known as backbenchers. They're kind of just token symbols, and they don't really have, a say. So I think it would be interesting to see more females, more marginalized, disadvantaged, even Indigenous peoples in politics. What do you think?
Well, this is an interesting point, and Beau and Evangeline, feel free to jump in on this. If the 20-year-old gentleman was actually a woman, do you think that would change something in Parliament?
We had a female Prime Minister here Julia Gillard. And most of the discussions, just in mass media, was about, more petty things that you don't generally hear about our current Prime Minister, Tony Abbott. And a lot of people, be like, why don't you like Julia Gillard? And it would be, I don't like the colour of her hair.
Yeah, trivial stuff.
Yeah, so it's definitely a challenge that females face within politics, I think. What do you think, Bo?
Yeah, I think especially for Julia Gillard, as you mentioned, that she has, publicly said that it'll be a lot easier for the next woman Prime Minister. She's had to pave the way and had to deal with a lot of the stereotypes that have come with it. And unfortunately for her, it was a horrible situation. She's, been painted certain ways in the media. But I think it is important that we do stop focusing on the gender stereotypes and actually just focus on the policies and what really matters.
Yeah, and it's interesting because 43% of millennials are non-white, so it would be nice to see some diversity, in Parliament, in Canadian Parliament, Australian Parliament. So I think that's, gender parity and, just diversity is something that needs to be addressed for sure. And Gen Y, we've inherited an economy that's in the red, so it doesn't come as a surprise that Yers exhibit lower levels in political trust than any other age group. This is especially true when it comes to capitalists in suits who pass around money like a toy doll.
And millennials have fallen on hard times. I mean, the Labour of Statistics say that the unemployment rate for young people is still hovering at 12% for Yers between the ages of 20 to 24.
Despite the bleak economic setbacks, we're actually the most optimistic generation in the country. In an American poll, 49% of millennials believe the best days still lie ahead.
And it's this bullish optimism for a better future that millennials hope to change society. Instead of looking wide-eyed to Social Security and to other government safety nets, Yers are taking action with equality movements.
Although we feel the economic effects every day as we graduate with degrees and wake up with demanding debt, we've grown sea legs and steel nerves in the economy's really choppy waters.
So it's a safe bet that the world has yet to experience its greatest political moments with Generation Y at the rudder.
I agree. We want to thank you for watching Gen Y Perspective, and be sure to continue the conversation on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram with the hashtag Gen Y Perspective. And head over to our website, genyperspective.com, for more videos and inside stories on this episode.
And of course, we want to give a huge thank you to Evangeline and Bo in Australia. We know you've had a long day, ladies, and we really, really appreciate you joining us.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
And if you're interested in the G20 and what's going on in Brisbane, you can visit us at uqg20.com.
Duly noted. I'm Ashley Peters.
And I'm Jake Nothdurft.
And this has been Gen Y Perspective, just a bunch of 20-somethings poking holes in millennial stereotypes.